Greetings, everyone. I have about 15 minutes to talk to you about Chapter 2 of the Spiritan Rule of Life. And I'm really not going to get into a critique of it so much as talk about things that have been going on in the field of mission theology over the last few years that intersect with it, and in some cases really challenge it quite significantly. But we've only got a few minutes to do this, and so I'm just going to do it in three very simple steps. I'm going to talk about mission, I'm going to talk about evangelization, and then I'm going to talk about Spiritan discipleship. And then we'll see if we can bring them together, and there'll be enough loose ends so that people can continue to talk and agree or disagree or elaborate as much as you like. So I start with mission, and this chapter in Spiritan Rule of Life is called Our Mission, and that's where it begins to get just a tiny bit neuralgic for me. The mission that we are talking about is always God's mission. The subject of mission is always God. So for the last 70 or 80 years, the church has been talking about the Missio Dei, and everything begins there. So mission would be a way of looking at the way God works and what God does and how God does it. And since all language about God is analogical, what we tend to do when we're trying to get close to the mystery is to throw an analogy out and say God is like this. The analogy we use when we're talking about mission, when we're talking about the mission of the Trinity, is called the organic analogy. It's about breathing in and breathing out. And you need those two movements in order to have sustained breathing and therefore sustained life. So God's breathing out would be, send forth your spirit and they shall be created and you will renew the face of the earth. This is God's continuous self-outpouring, the missio, the movement, if you like, from the center to the absolute extremes. This is God's cosmic creativity, sending forth the spirit, sending forth life. And then God's breathing in would be God's reconciling activity, God's calling people back, come back to me, my people. So it would be the covenantal relationship between God and God's people, calling people back. And then the movement then continues. God continues to breathe out and in fact breathe us out as God's people and calls us back and reconciles us and heals us and brings us and makes community of us in order to send us out again. So we get this constant idea that God is what basically keeps the entirety of creation alive, sustains it by God's mission, by the Missio Dei. And that mission of God is like God's goodness, just totally everywhere. It gives us an idea of what we might be trying to get hold of when we ourselves are starting to talk about mission. But before we can talk about ourselves and mission, we have to try and bring this great mystery of the Trinity into something a little bit more comprehensible to ourselves. And the way we do that is that we move from the idea of mission or Missio Dei to the notion of evangelization. And evangelization, in essence, is simply the way Jesus himself incarnates this timeless Trinitarian mission. In other words, what happens is that in the fullness of time, Jesus brings God's eternal mission down to earth, grounds it in Palestine, grounds it in the 1st century AD, grounds it in the person of a male Jew. And this is God's mission now, not so much the eternal mystery as the historical reality. This is God's mission now among us. And what happens is that Jesus is constantly trying to explain to people how what he is doing is simply a continuation of what God has always been doing. The Father has been working until now, he says, and now I'm working. The Father and I are one. I came not to do my own will, but to do the will of the one who sent me. And so Jesus is constantly saying that he's not making this up as he goes along. He has received something from his Father, and that he has received from his Father, he is going to continue to do in fidelity to his Father. But it is the work of his Abba. It is the work of the Holy Spirit who has sent him on earth. And what Jesus does is effectively then bring this mission into a very concrete situation and allow it to play itself out in terms of the exigencies of that situation. In other words, people are going to be encountering Jesus, and Jesus is going to be encountering people. And the dynamic of mission, as Jesus does it, is going to be determined by whatever shows up. People need Jesus. Jesus needs people to hear him. Sometimes he's going to be preaching to them and they're sitting down listening. Sometimes he's going to be engaging with them and listening to them and responding to them. And this, if you like, is the way Jesus continues on earth what is being done in heaven. That God's will is being done on earth as it is in heaven. But in order to simplify it, what has happened over the last 30 or 40 years is that there has been a surprising consensus that the characteristics of evangelization, meaning the characteristics of the way Jesus does mission, can be reduced, if you like, to 4 headings. And they are proclamation and witness and dialogue and liberation. And this is what is generally spoken of as integral evangelization. In other words, Jesus does proclamation, and Jesus does witness, and Jesus does dialogue, and Jesus does liberation. And all of them are absolutely essential. It's not that Jesus does one at the expense of another. It's not that Jesus prioritizes one over the other. It's not that proclamation is more important or less important than dialogue or witness. What is important is that Jesus is going to engage and undertake to do all of these things as and when they are necessary. And as he does so in faithfulness to his Abba, he is doing integral mission. When we then, in a moment, come to think about what we have to do is what Jesus does. And as Jesus integrates mission, so we have to integrate mission. So Jesus proclaims, and Jesus witnesses, and Jesus dialogues, and Jesus liberates. And you can see this coming out very well in this chapter 2. If I look through the chapter 2 and I look for the number of times it refers to proclamation and witness and liberation and dialogue, it's all over the place. Sometimes it's very explicit, mission as liberation, mission as dialogue. Sometimes it's a little bit more implicit, but it's all there, it's all over the place. And this chapter starts us off by reminding us that it is the Spirit that gives life and direction to our entire apostolate. But maybe what we should interpolate there is it is the Spirit that gives life and direction to Jesus' apostolate. And it is because of Jesus' apostolate that we know what we're supposed to be doing. We don't make it up. We don't do it according as we want to do it, because it isn't our mission. And it isn't the church's mission. Whatever we do as church and whatever we do as Spiritans is derivative of what Jesus is doing. We do it in the name of Jesus. We do it because Jesus did it. And we do it because Jesus is telling us and asking us to continue to do it in his name. So we have proclamation and witness and dialogue and liberation. And our responsibility then is to continue to do what Jesus does as integral liberation. So I've talked a little bit about mission as that which characterizes the great mystery of the Trinity. I've talked about evangelization as the way in which Jesus opens up the mystery so that the likes of you and me can actually grasp it. Because all we have to do is to look at Jesus and then we say, I get it. I understand what God has been doing and what God is doing in Jesus. And then the third piece then is discipleship. Or if you like to put it another way, our own response as Spiritans to the call of God through Jesus. And so therefore we say to ourselves, okay, what is our responsibility as Spiritans and as disciples? And I think the first thing to just remember is that discipleship is both an individual call and a communal call. In other words, the disciples are called individually one by one. But you cannot be a disciple as an individualist. Disciples are called individually one by one in order to create and form and be sustained by and sustain a community. So we've got to find out how we are living as Spiritans, both individually and in relation to the community. And the one cannot do duty for the other. We've got to be able to identify how each one of us is living up to what we are called to do. And what we are called to do is what Jesus does. We are called to proclaim. We're called to witness. We're called to dialogue. And we are called to liberate. But we cannot possibly do any of these in the abstract. These can only be done in the concrete. And so I want to give you 4 little headings of the way in which concretely Jesus brings God's mission down to earth as proclamation and witness and dialogue and liberation, and then says to us, now, this is how I did it. This is how you can do it. And the 4 ways in which Jesus does the mission is, number 1, by encounter. Number 2, by table fellowship. Number 3, by foot washing. And number 4, by boundary crossing. And that really gives us the measure of the challenge facing each one of us. How do I encounter? Who do I encounter? What is the nature of my encounters? Do I shy away from encounters? Do I overwhelm people with my encounters? Or do I try to do as Jesus does and encounter people in the best way I can do in the circumstances of my life? I don't have to go to Africa. I don't have to be 25. I have to encounter people in the circumstances of my life. The second one is table fellowship. And table fellowship is really another way of talking about horizontal ministry. I can very easily stand up, and I can very easily proclaim, and I can very easily declaim, and I can very easily tell people what to do. And that might very well be part of mission, and it certainly is part of what Jesus does. But more often than not, Jesus is sitting down. And more often than not, when he's sitting down, he's at table. And more often than not, when he's at table, he's with all the wrong people in all the wrong places. So the kinds of people that Jesus encounters, he encounters very largely at table. He invites the uninvited. He invites himself to the places where really good people would not go. One of my favorite stories is the story that Mark tells of Jesus in the house of Simon the leper. Why do we need to know that it's the house of Simon the leper? Well, Mark wants us to know that specifically because he wants us to know who Jesus hangs out with. He hangs out with the wrong crowd. So if the first way in which we do mission is by encounter, the second way is by table fellowship. So who do we eat with? Who do we not eat with? Who do we like to be seen with? Who would we never be seen with? To what extent is our table fellowship inclusive? And to what extent is it exclusive? The table fellowship of Jesus was radically inclusive. And we are called to create a radically inclusive community. But right behind me is the table of exclusion. Right behind me is the Eucharistic table, where we are told the poor and the lame and the sinners and the blind and the prostitutes and everybody else are welcome to eat and drink at this table. And yet, practically speaking, we stop them from coming, and we tell them that they can only come on certain circumstances. So part of our challenge as mission is to ask ourselves again, to what extent are we doing what Jesus did in terms of table fellowship? The third one, of course, is foot washing. And if proclamation is standing up higher than everybody else, and if table fellowship is being at the same level as everybody else, then foot washing is being lower than everybody else. And this is how Jesus models discipleship. And this is how Jesus does mission. And he says, if you want to be my disciples, A, you must let me wash your feet. And B, you must wash each other's feet. So the third one would be, whose feet do we wash? Metaphorically, physically. Whose feet do we never wash? Or we never think of washing? Where do we go out of our way to meet people and to wash the feet of the people we meet? Or by contrast, who do we expect to wash our feet? Who do we expect to treat us with dignity? Jesus is the measure of our apostolate and our ministry. And the final one, of course, is boundary crossing. And this, I think, is where we need to just bring in one more word, and the word is missional. We have tended to polarize mission and missionaries over against everybody else. And we've tended in the past to speak about mission or missionaries as an elite group of people who do a certain amount of things far, far away and that ordinary people can't do. What we've got to do is to collapse that idea of elitism or separateness and make ourselves aware of the fact that we are called by baptism to become a missionary people. And the word missional is the word that people use to express the way in which we live out our baptism. We as Spiritans may at some point in our lives have been or be missionary in the classic sense. We must always be, until we die, missional as Jesus was missional. He didn't go very far away from home, but he looked for the boundaries, and he looked for the excluded and the marginalized and the muted and the forgotten and the abandoned. And he went looking for them. And he crossed boundaries that compromised him and compromised his reputation. And if we want to call ourselves disciples, and if we want to call ourselves missionaries, and if we want to talk about Spiritan mission, we're going to have to do the same.